Oh, church, when did we lose our way?
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. I'm your host, John Williamson, and we are back this week with a brand new episode and a brand new guest, Dr. Garrick Allen, to talk about his brand new book, Words Are Not Enough, Paratexts, Manuscripts, and the Real New Testament. But before we jump into that, if you enjoyed this show, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing so you don't miss out on a single new episode, and sharing with a friend. We're an independent podcast, and that's the way that we get out to new people. You can also keep up on everything that we're doing here by checking out our website, www.thedeconstructionist.org, where we have our blog, social media links, and all of our back catalog of episodes that you can stream directly from the site. With that being said, let's get to it. Here's my guest, Garrick freaking Allen.
Made us think that we could keep others away.
All right, excited to have my guest on this week, Garrick Allen. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So you're broadcasting live from one of my favorite countries, if not my favorite country. And I'm not just saying that because my grandfather was born in Scotland, but you are in Glasgow.
That's right. Best city in Scotland.
Man, yeah. So I definitely make note of that, Adam. We have to go there next time. But tell you we were talking before we started recording. You've got a pretty cool journey in terms of other places you've been prior to landing in Glasgow. So tell people a little bit about yourself, your background, and sort of how you ended up in Glasgow.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm from Seattle originally, as you can tell from my accent. I'm not a Glaswegian. So from Seattle originally, studied there, went to graduate school at St. Andrews, so spent a few years on the east coast of Scotland, and then kind of did the postdoc world tour for a while and spent some time in Germany, Ireland, and now we're back in Scotland. So it's a good spot to be. It's really dark this time of year, so there's nothing to do but go to the library and go to the pub, and it's a good life.
As I say, I could think of way worse places to go. So tell people a little bit about. Hang on, as I reach for the book here. Words Are Not Enough: Paratexts, Manuscripts, and the Real New Testament. What ultimately inspired you to write a book on this particular topic?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. So, we're running a number of big research projects in Glasgow right now that focus on the New Testament's manuscripts in a number of different directions, more sort of technical, scholarly stuff. But I was really interested in using the manuscripts as a way to think about what the Bible is, what defines it from the very first time it was composed to a Bible you pick up on the shelf, and to think about what's so important about this text by looking at how other people in the past have produced, read, transmitted, moved this text from the first century on to us. So there's a lot of rich material there. It's the most widely transmitted ancient text from antiquity, over 5,600 manuscripts. And we've really only begun to explore what this sort of set of material has to offer for us.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So my first initial question is, because I think a lot of the people listening are laymen, just like myself, and so there's a lot of things that we have assumptions about in terms of things that we think that we know, right, about the New Testament. And the first misconception, obviously, is the fact that this thing fell out of the sky in a fully formed book, and that's not the case. So start off talking about, like, what do we actually know for certain about the New Testament, and in terms of things that we can say for relative certainty versus what we don't know at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's right. When we think about the New Testament, we think of, or the Bible more generally, a sort of disembodied perfect text floating around just waiting to be put in a printed book you can buy at Barnes & Noble. But actually, like, when you look at the manuscripts, I think the one thing that really strikes you, and the one thing that is always certain, is an element of change and flux, whether that has to do with the Greek text of the New Testament, which changes in small scale ways from manuscript to manuscript. These are handmade objects. And also the material they're made on, the size of the manuscript, which books are in there, in what order. And then, this book really explores paratexts, which is all the things around the biblical text that are always in the manuscripts alongside it and that are framing our reading experiences. So the thing that I think I take for granted is that the Bible is in a state of change. It's a process not a finished, complete work that you can buy at the bookshop, although, that's one instantiation of this tradition. So for me, the manuscripts really point up the fact that the Bibles that we can pick up today are a pretty new phenomenon in the history of Bible reading. And we can see how other people of the past have engaged these texts in the same way.
Yeah, and I should point out that you've already angered so many people by saying, change,
Yeah, I mean, can I just say, a change doesn't mean corrupt. It doesn't mean bad. We tend to think in our age of printed books where you can print the same book a million times exactly the same. We tend to think of change as problematic for the things that are really important. But in the ancient world, when you have to hand make the parchment and paper you want to use, you had to make the ink and make your quills and do these sorts of things. Change is central to the things that people care for most. It's like a garden. If you didn't change your garden, it would die. If you didn't tend it, move things around, put things in the right place, you wouldn't get anything from it. The Bible's the same way. People tend to it and it changes because it's important to these communities from the first century onward. So it's actually a sort of counterintuitive thing to the narrative of the Bible as the sort of unchanging, perfect word of God. Yes, in some way, but also, if you don't have people engaging with this text, it disappears. So this is why I think change is a good thing.
Excellent. Thank you for covering that.
Sure.
I do. I mean, that is a real thing that I find that we fight against, specifically in the Western world, is this notion that it is perfect, unchanging, and has always been in the form that we know it in today, which is not the case. And you mentioned manuscripts, so talk a little bit about that, because I do think it's important to note, how far back do we go? Do we have original manuscripts, the very first writings, or do we not?
Only. No, we don't. I mean, the earliest copies go back pretty early to the 2nd and 3rd century. There's fragmentary papyrus copies from garbage dumps in Egypt, mostly found in the 19th century. The earliest copy of Paul's letters that we know of is just across the Irish Sea in Dublin at the Chester Beatty Library, and so they're quite close by. So we can go back pretty far, and there is a lot of consistency in the tradition. There's no huge, large-scale changes. There's no big corruptions in the tradition. But there's this series of small-scale sort of tending changes to these things. So the manuscripts we have date from, as I said, the 2nd on the early side through to the 19th and 20th century, very late copies of printed editions of things we find at monasteries. But the vast majority of stuff that we have for the Greek New Testament is medieval. There's a handful of 4th and 5th century full Bible codexes in Greek that are very unusual and very cool. 2 are in London, one's in the Vatican, one's in Paris. So they're all fairly close by. But we have a sort of gap from the 6th to the 9th century. There's not that much material, and then you see an explosion of what we have thereafter. So it's spotty at the early stages, but you can get a fairly good picture of the sorts of things that people are doing with the New Testament at a fairly early stage.
And talk a little bit too about the fact that obviously this is, and we'll talk more about this. Obviously, you talk about this in the book as well, is the fact that, as you've mentioned, that the fully formed bound version is a relatively new concept brought on advancements in technology and printing. Before that, how were people getting their Bible fix essentially at that point?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, so there's 3 or 4 full Bible codices from the 4th and 5th century, as I mentioned, and they have all of the Old Testament in Greek, all of the New Testament in Greek, but in all different orders of the books. And then a couple of them have other texts at the end, Clementine literature, the Epistle of Barnabas, and these sorts of things. So even at this early stage, things are moving around quite a bit, and these are highly unusual in the big picture of things. But most of the time, people are engaging biblical texts in smaller collections. So there's a lot of gospel books that are just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's a lot of what we call apostolos manuscripts, which is Acts, the Catholic epistles, and then Paul's letters thereafter. Revelation's kind of it's doing out there doing its own thing. Sometimes with these things, sometimes not, very spotty. But in the Greek tradition, it tends to be these smaller collections. I mean, of the over 5,600 Greek manuscripts we have, only around 50 of them were designed to have all 27 books of the New Testament. And only 3 or 4 of those have them in the order that we would recognize when we picked an English Bible off a bookshelf today. So people are engaging these things in different contexts, doing different things with them, often hearing them in liturgy or in church services, as opposed to sort of private reading of biblical text. That's a very modern phenomenon. So, how you use the Bible, what works it's connected to, what other markings are around the edges of the manuscript and on the front and the back changes how people engage with these things. So, when you look at the manuscripts, you see our modern Bibles are very cool because we kind of have it all there, but they're also very anomalous in some way.
Yeah. And talk a little bit about like, what can we learn? What can we take away from the fact that, that stat that you just gave, just in terms of like how these were sort of bunched or grouped together, in terms of the writings. What does that tell us about early Christians and sort of how, how they viewed these sacred texts?
Yeah. I mean, I think the earliest Christians who wrote these traditions and the earliest people who collected them and put them into groups, collected Paul's letters into a corpus and gave them titles and did all this stuff and passed them on. I think these texts are hugely important for these communities. The fact that there are so many manuscripts and that they're so diverse, I think speaks to that reality. But it shows that people are continually grappling with what these texts are for, what their import is, what we do with them. The technologies of book production change and enable people to do new things with the biblical texts, to arrange them in new ways, to create cross-references between them. And they actually created a very interesting pathways for reading that we don't have in our modern Bibles. So you get glimpses at the things that people are doing, but there's this constant negotiation between this biblical text, which is, I think, central and important and viewed as revelatory and I think an important tradition for almost every Christian community in existence. But people are continually wrestling with these traditions and what to do with them, how to frame the interpretation, how to help people understand them, how to give people a guideline into this really complicated set of texts.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Like there are a lot of things you point out throughout the book that, just not things I would have necessarily considered before. Before we get into that, starting at the beginning, you talk about the materiality of the Bible. You say how a book is made says something about its text and what we should do with it. Tell folks what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to a bookshop, you can scan the shelves and you can see a cheap paperback, a little paperback book and know, okay, it's probably going to be about $20. I could pick this up. It's not going to be a big monument on my shelf. It's just be something I read. But if you go and pick, spend $100 on a big hardbound, leather-bound family Bible with all the bells and whistles and these things, it's going to be an important artifact in your family. It's going to be something maybe you pass down from generation to generation. It's going to be something you use to remember the key parts of your family's life or whatever. But the way a book is made communicates certain things to us. So, you can spot a dictionary by the notches in the forend of the paper. You can spot, I'm just looking at my bookshelf here, a lexicon by how big it is and the hardback nature and these sorts of things. So the materials tell us something. And the same is true of the manuscripts that you see. If it's really fine parchment and very clear writing and wide margins, it's meant for some sort of monumental purpose, maybe a very wealthy patron or something like this. And then you see these really chicken scratchy, cursive, hard to read scripts on parchment that has a bunch of holes in it, which may just be for a local community or a group of people who are reading these for their own sustenance or whatever. But the manuscripts are really varied, even more than, a modern bookshop. But, the physicality of the book, the way it smells, the way it feels, you can see people's fingerprints on the parchment. You can see candle wax drippings where people have been reading in the evening. You can smell the incense come off some manuscripts that were used in churches. And being in the physical presence of these things really, it gets me excited anyway. So,
yeah, I mean, the way you describe it, it feels like there's so much character to these versions of the text than sort of the sterile version that's the millionth printed off copy or whatever we get from, like you said, the Barnes and Noble. It feels like there's a lot more character and a lot more lived experience sort of in the text.
That's right. Yeah, no, I agree completely. When you view the Bible as either an immaterial, perfect text out there that we can grab somehow, or as just the book that you have in front of you, you lose all of this access to thousands of anonymous people who left the only imprint of their existence on the pages of these books. So you lose this sort of empathetic perspective that you're part of a broader history of people reading, grappling with, engaging these texts for various reasons.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the words I want you to define for folks, because we're going to talk a lot about it. Obviously, it's a core theme of the book, is this word paratext.
Yeah.
Explain to listeners what that is and what that tells manuscripts that make up the New Testament.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, paratexts are, at least to my mind, everything that you find in a book beyond the main text itself. So when you pick up a modern book, it's full of paratexts, all the legal material at the front, the title pages, titles, subtitles, footnotes, page numbers, indices, bibliography, any of these sorts of things that you would see in any sort of book you would pick up today. And the manuscripts have a really rich, diverse set of paratexts attached to each work in different ways that do different things to people as you read. And so these, I mean, to begin to describe the vastness of the New Testament's paratextuality in its manuscript is a big lift. But I guess like a good corollary is when you pick up a modern English Bible, full of paratexts, prefaces, tables of contents, page numbers, subtitles, chapter and verse divisions. All of these sorts of things were not written by the authors of these texts. None of these things go back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, or whoever. These are the products of tradition, of usually, but not always, anonymous people who have worked to organize the Bible in some way, to create modes of interpretation that people can engage with, to help people make sense of their sacred texts. So paratexts are everywhere, whether you're looking at manuscripts, printed books, online text, digital texts, whatever. But the manuscripts have a particularly rich tradition that we really don't have access to when we're looking at modern Bibles. So I wanted to explore some of these traditions and to see how it helps us think about what the Bible is and how we can approach it.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point that I had not considered before, is just this idea that the very earliest versions of these texts would have been constructed in a very different way, which would have made it more difficult to read. And there was a lot of work over a long period of time by a lot of, as you said, nameless people who kind of put it into more of a digestible form with chapters and verses and stuff like that. So talk a little bit about that. In specific, you talk about this guy named Eusebius of Caesarea. Mm-hmm. And why is his commentary so important in understanding like sort of the modern or like even the early Christian history?
Yeah. I mean, the sort of cradle of paratextual play with the New Testament is in Caesarea in the 3rd and 4th century with the work of Origen on the Old Testament and Eusebius on the New Testament. These guys do a lot, just voluminous writings, church histories, interpretive tracts, commentaries, all these sorts of things. But one of the most important things that Eusebius did was create something called the canon table system for the Gospels. So Eusebius knew something that anyone who has ever read the New Testament knows, is that there are 4 Gospels right at the beginning. They're all pretty similar, but there's a lot of differences among them too. So this is a problem. So how do you handle this? What Eusebius did is he created, way before the modern chapter and verses that we know existed, the first system that enables you to find your place in the Gospels. So instead of having 24 chapters in Matthew, he had, 200 and some, splitting the text into really small units, doing this for each of the 4 Gospels, and then creating a set of tables at the front of the Gospel book that you could go see where that number had parallels in Matthew or in Mark, Luke, or John, or what have you. Table 1 is instances where Eusebius thinks that all the Gospels have pretty much the same passage. Table 2 is where it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke alone, and all the way down to table 10 where it's all the passages that the Gospels have only to themselves. So you can trace the really complicated relationships between the Gospels without breaking up their texts or their narratives. You can still read them straight across one at a time, or you can read them in this really hypertextual way where you're looking at the margins, finding a number, going to a table, going to a different Gospel, and then you have like both sections open as you hold the big chunk in the middle in your hand, and you can flip back and forth and look at the passages and compare them. So he kind of puts it all on display. Here's all their differences and all their glory. To Eusebius, he thinks they end up saying the same thing, more or less, not very surprising. But he created this really powerful tool for comparison that really has never been duplicated. And our modern Bibles really have nothing like this. So, and this system appears in nearly every gospel manuscript we have. It's ubiquitous. You can't escape it. So it's funny today when you pick up the Gospels, you sometimes have subtitles with parallels written by modern editors, but it's really just like vague ghost of what Eusebius has done in this really interesting way that really helps us to do a lot of cool interpretive things and to think about the Gospels and their interrelationships in new ways and to acknowledge the reality that these things do differ. But when you put them in a conversation, you can do some things with them.
Yeah, and it immediately brings to mind the scholarship that's been done on, the similarities in regards to a possible common document that some of the gospel writers sort of pulled from the, Gospel of Q or what have you. So it's kind of interesting because that was very, very early on, obviously, Eusebius.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very early. It's early 4th century. I mean, Eusebius, then some of his other writings often appear in the margins of gospel manuscripts at particularly problematic passages. So one of them is the Easter morning narratives in each of the Gospels. They each give a slightly different description of what day it was, what morning it was, what time it was, who was there at the tomb, these sorts of differences. And often in some of these manuscripts that have commentary in the margins, Eusebius's text is there to say, well, when you look at this one, it's this, but they actually mean this, and they actually all kind of fit together. So, his influence is, determined what people did with the Gospels for over 1,000 years. And our modern Bibles really obscure that reality. And when you look at what he does and how the system works, it's complicated for sure, but once you get a hang of it, it's not so mystifying. You can do some very different things than we do. I think our Bibles today tend to encourage us to read each of these narratives like it's a novel from front to back. But for Eusebius, they're meant you can read them that way. The system enables you to, but it also really encourages you to be flipping back and forth constantly, to read all the Gospels in conversation with one another and all their weirdness. This is what he's trying to get people to do.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And again, it goes back to your sort of central point that there are all these different things that sort of you take for granted or don't even potentially notice in the modern Bible that really influence the ways in which you read the Bible and understand the Bible. And so, you talked about this system, within early Christianity that's trying to make sense of it and trying to make it more easy to reference. You also talk about the role of the preface, which is a common literary tool in most books, I would say. And so talk about how prefaces direct our limited attention resources, as you say. How are prefaces used in such a way within the New Testament?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, the thing about Paratexts, I'll say at the start is these things are hidden in plain sight. I mean, we often take them for granted, skip over them, don't even clock that we're reading something that's sort of set off from the main text itself. So once you see them, you can't unsee them. So this is how I one of the ways I got into thinking about this. But in terms of prefaces, if you picked up, and one thing I talk about in the book is the Schofield Reference Bible. It's this 19th century dispensationalist, very conservative evangelical annotated Bible created by this ex-Confederate soldier. Very interesting fellow. But it's the best-selling book at Oxford University Press history still today, thanks to its American audience. But what Schofield does is creates this nested set of prefaces, like a preface on what the Bible is as a whole story, and then one for the Old Testament and the New Testament, one for each of the subsections of the Gospels and Paul's letters, and then a preface for each work itself, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's just this really oppressive, prescriptive way of thinking about what the Bible is, how these collections work, what they do, and so on. And you find similar things in the manuscript, less prescriptive, but the prefaces point out particular things about the work that once you read carefully, as you're reading, you begin to see these things more clearly. I think the best example is there's a set of paratexts called the Euthalian apparatus, which most New Testament scholars have never even heard of. Like, it's very rarefied stuff, even if it's in nearly every manuscript of Acts, Catholic epistles, and Paul's letters that we have. So it's everywhere. But it has a preface to Acts that gives you like one sentence on the narrative, like it's about the early church and Paul. But then you get two lists. You get a list of apostles and disciples and characters in the book. And then you get a list of miracles that happen in Acts, which you don't tend to think of Acts as a place where miracles occur. But once you start reading the work with these lists in mind, you're keyed on for particular characters and their inner relationships, where they come from, how they interact with Paul and whoever else he's traveling with. And then the miracles, the thing the apostles do, the things that happened to Paul on his shipwreck journey and his call on the Damascus Road and all these sorts of things. So it reframes what you're reading and it draws your attention to those things that it wants you to focus on for whatever reason. This one doesn't tell us why it wants us to focus on that, but that's what it is. So, any preface for any modern Bible, functions similarly, like the chapter on the Green Bible, which I really want to like. And what this Bible does is it prints any text having to do with creation or creation care in green ink, to draw your attention to environmental issues. It's a very 2009 idea. But the green ink is fine and nice and interesting and a fun play on like the red text for Jesus's words and so on. But it has like 150 pages of prefaces, essays from Christian environmentalists and famous theologians and previous guests on this podcast who try to attune people to, Christians' requirement to care for the earth as a way of caring for the poor and creation and so on. So, prefaces can go a bit awry sometimes, go a bit over the top, but it's, a useful tool that is really broadly distributed throughout the manuscripts. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of different prefaces for the Gospels, for example, a few different ones for Revelation, but these things are almost always a part of the manuscripts that we see. These are like ingrained parts of what makes the Bible, of what makes Scripture. And one of the things I try to argue is that it's these paratexts, all these things around the text itself that organize these works into scriptural texts. Without paratexts, there is no Bible.
Yeah, I remember that line that's literally in the book. And
it's my only good line. It's my only good line.
That's not good. There's some great lines in this book. So listeners, go out and grab a copy. But talk about, so on the one hand, we've got the prefaces that kind of set you up, kind of point you in certain directions. There's also the role of prologues as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So there's like a hierarchy of prologues and prefaces. The Greek uses different words for the prologos, so it's a Greek word for sure. But like the Euthalian system, again, for example, was this set of lists and prefaces and prologues to Acts, the Catholic epistles, and Paul's letters. There are prologues, one for Acts, one for the Catholic epistles, and one for Paul's letters. And not surprisingly, the ones for Paul's letters is really long, gives you a lot of detail about the books, who sent them to where, from which place, when Paul was in prison, what the content of each of the books is. And then the Catholic epistles one is like 80% a dedication to a patron and 2 lines on the Catholic epistles. So, the prologues, these ones aren't super exciting, but they do show that even in the ancient world, in late antiquity, in the medieval world, in the Byzantine world, people still gave way more attention to Paul's letters than they do to the Catholic epistles, to poor 1, 2, 3 John, 1, 2 Peter, James and Jude, and to Acts even. The Acts prologue is basically just a summary of what Paul does in the book. So everything is still really oriented toward Paul. So you can still see some of the things that we would, with the trends in Bible reading that exist today, go way back. Like we're part of a much bigger story in this regard.
Does he have I'm alive. Is God even here? Does she care that I doubt? Does she care that I fear? Something tells me God will survive. So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know. I think the truth is, if God has a face, his face must look like yours. Did God kill his kid? Did he have to have blood before he would forgive? Maybe we made a God that looks like us. Does God know my name? Is the ache in my soul just confined to my brain? Even so, does that mean it's not real? So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face, her face must look like yours. A face like a Tina, an Ahmed or Mildred, a Russ and his husband, Gus and their children. A face like a Kim, a Ted or Tyrone, a Lucy born with an extra chromosome, a Pablo with legs he can't move by himself, a girl born a Daniel who now is Danielle, a Bill H. and Yee, even white guys named Todd. If you have a heartbeat, you are the face of God. So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face, her face must look. If God has a face, his face must look